Hi there. Welcome to Deep Sleep Stories, where slow, gentle tales help ease your mind and quiet the day. Tonight's story is called The Ashes of a Cord. It's a peaceful journey through the days after war, where a village must choose how to heal, or whether to. So get comfortable. Let the day fall away. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories. Now, let's begin. The Ashes of a Cord. The war had ended not with thunder, but with ink. Not on a battlefield, but in a chapel-turned-courtroom, where the stone walls still bore soot from older fires. Across the realm, horns had fallen silent. Steel was sheathed. A parchment sealed in red wax had done what 10 winters of blood could not. And yet peace did not feel like peace. In the lowlands of Wessex, tucked between a river bend and an old forest road, the village of Gravesend stirred with early spring. Buds peeked through frost-cracked bark. Smoke rose from thatched chimneys. And the people, older, quieter now, returned to routine like hands remembering forgotten movements. Edric Fletcher stood barefoot in the dew-wet grass, axe resting across one shoulder. His cottage leaned like a drunk against the hill, but it was standing, more than could be said for most things after the war. He had once been a bowman in the 6th Regiment of Northlight. He'd served under banners stitched by hand, beside men who bled before breakfast. He came home to an empty hearth and a broken gate. Today, he was going to fetch timber. The south woods had good elm, and the chapel roof still leaked. He followed the old road through the ash grove, humming low, a tune with no name, something his brother used to sing. As he reached the ruins of an outpost chapel, its bones long blackened by fire, he slowed. There, nailed to the trunk of a hawthorn tree, was a square of parchment, stained, curled, hastily inked. No peace for cowards. No crown for traitors. The blood of kings will rise again. At the bottom, drawn in red wax and soot, was the unmistakable symbol. A falcon with outstretched wings, pierced through with a black thorn. Edric stared for a long moment. His pulse drummed in his ears. The falcon thorn. He had seen that mark once, years ago, branded on a shield buried in snow. A rebel faction born in shadows, unwilling to surrender even as cities burned. The mark had been outlawed. Erased. Or so the kingdom believed. He tore the parchment down, folded it twice, then twice again. He tucked it into his belt, and turned back toward the village. The chapel in Gravesend had become many things over the years: a triage ward, a gathering hall, a grain store, and most recently, a place for peace to sit and think. Its altar had long since crumbled, but Sister Merwin kept it swept. She lit candles in the morning, not to saints, but to silence. She had been a healer once, and she still was, just no longer with herbs alone. When Edric entered, his boots wet with mud and morning mist, she was washing linens in a basin near the rear wall. Her sleeves were rolled. Her expression softened when she saw him. "You're back early," she said. He handed her the parchment. Her fingers, still damp, hesitated before unfolding it. Her lips moved as she read, but no sound came. Then, she folded it again, more carefully than before. "Where?" she asked. "Hawthorn tree by the old road. Near the scorched chapel." Merwin glanced at the ceiling. "Not the first." Edric frowned. "What?" She turned to a small box by the hearth and drew out a second parchment, nearly identical. Same words. Same ink. "It was left at the well-post last night." Footsteps echoed from the back of the chapel. "You've both seen them now," came a voice, low and rasped like a blade drawn across stone. Osric Hales stepped into the light, cloak damp, hood pushed back, gray in his hair though his eyes were still sharp. He'd once been a scout in the black ranks, the kind of soldier no one remembered until it was too late. "I found one by the granary," he said. "They're spreading fast. And quiet." Edric crossed his arms. "Who's bold enough to hang rebel signs after peace has been signed?" "The kind who don't want peace," Osric muttered. Merwin's voice was calm but firm. "Then we need to act. Before fear does it for us." By nightfall, word had reached the tavern. In a village this small, whispers moved faster than wind. In the long lantern inn, candles glowed low, and worry sat at every table. No one spoke of the signs aloud, but their silence screamed of it. And just before the shutters were drawn, a rider arrived from the east, cloaked, gloved, his face shadowed by the firelight. He asked for water, not ale. Sat in the corner. Said little. But Edric saw the imprint on his boots as he passed. A falcon. Barely visible. Embossed in the leather heel. He kept walking. But in his mind, a new fire had lit. Peace was signed. But something darker had signed itself into the soil. The morning after the signs were found, the village of Gravend woke slowly, like a bruised man unsure of his own limbs. Fog clung to the earth in long coils, and the bell atop the chapel tolled once, low and reluctant, as if even it were not yet ready to speak. Sister Merwin was the first to rise. She kept her days full, as all healers did after war. She boiled water. She wiped the chapel steps with a rag soaked in rosemary and lye. She ground dried yarrow with a mortar stone worn smooth by years of grief. But today, even her movements were different, careful, quiet, like something unseen was watching. She wasn't wrong. Edric passed through the square on his way to the blacksmith's barn. He carried a bundle of tools, most for wood, one for war. The tension in his jaw was visible, even through the spring mist. Osric joined him near the bridge, his hood drawn low. No new signs, Edric murmured. None yet, Osric replied. But the one who hung them, he's still here. How do you know? Osric tapped his temple. The air hasn't changed. Edric scoffed. That's not proof. No, Osric agreed. But it's what kept me alive at Yarrow Ditch when 5 scouts didn't come back. They walked on in silence. Around midday, a rider appeared, not with fanfare, but with dust. He was lean, his cloak road-worn, his horse drawn and wheezing. He bore a plain seal of the Accord Council, a faded blue ribbon tied to his saddle. Arlo Brooke had once served as a royal guardsman, but his armor was long since sold, and his pride worn down to dry humor and sore knees. He dismounted with a grunt outside the chapel and knocked twice on the doorframe. Don't shoot, he called. I bring news and questions. Possibly in that order. Merwin opened the door, saw the seal, and stepped aside. They gathered in the chapel, Merwin, Edric, Osric, and now Arlo. A small fire burned in the hearth, though no one sat too near it. The council received your raven, Arlo said, unrolling a cracked piece of parchment. 3 signs in one village is enough to raise concern. And in Sherwood? Merwin asked. We heard something. Arlo sighed. A captain was found hanged. Same sigil. Falcon Thorn? Edric's fists clenched. So it's spreading. Arlo nodded. Fast. Quiet. Not armies, not yet. But a movement. Something whispered. Something that wants blood again. Osric leaned forward. Then we find the source. Before it's too late. You're already too late, Arlo replied. The question is, can you stop what's already begun? That evening, the village's tavern, the Long Lantern, was full, but not lively. Shadows clung to the corners, and every drink felt heavier than the last. At the largest table sat old Roland, the former blacksmith. He held his tankard like a weapon and spoke with a voice loud enough for eavesdroppers. They tell us the war's over, he growled. But has anyone seen the king's face? Has he walked through our fields? Peace is a word for rich men. Across from him sat Tobin, a young farmer's son, thin and freckled. But no one's dying anymore, he said, uncertain. That has to mean something. Roland slammed his mug down. Not dying yet. At the bar, a man in a gray cloak sipped water instead of ale. He didn't join the talk. He didn't laugh. But when his boot shifted beneath the table, Edric, who was quietly watching from the far end, saw the edge of a leather heel. And on it, just barely visible, a falcon. Wings wide. The next morning, Merwin found a folded note on the chapel's altar. No seal. No signature. The writing was sharp and deliberate. Peace is not in treaties. Peace is in who gets to speak last. She brought it to Osric. This isn't a warning, he said, reading it twice. It's a boast. Someone here believes they're winning, she said softly. No, Osric said. Someone here believes they haven't lost. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A girl appeared at the chapel, no more than 13, thin, with straw-colored hair tied in a frayed blue ribbon. Her name was Mara, daughter of the stable's night hand. She usually ran errands and fed chickens. Quiet, forgettable. But today, her hands trembled. I saw someone, she whispered. Merwin bent low. When, child? 2 nights ago. He came behind the well. He put something on the tree. A parchment? The girl nodded. He had a gray cloak. And gloves. But when he reached up, his sleeve pulled back and I saw a mark. On his arm. What kind of mark? Osric asked gently. She swallowed. A crown. But it was broken. Osric stood slowly. That's not falcon thorn. That's something older. A loyalist symbol? Arlo asked. No, Osric said. Worse. Mara looked down. He saw me. Edric stepped closer. Did he follow you? I don't think so. But last night someone left a feather on our door. Merwin placed a hand on her shoulder. You did right to come. Osric's face darkened. They're watching us too now. That night, the candlelight inside the chapel burned longer than usual. Around the table, 4 figures sat in silence, a healer, a scout, a soldier, and a councilman. We need to know how far this goes, Arlo said. We will, Edric replied. And when we do, Merwin added, we'll need to choose whether peace is still worth fighting for. Osric, ever quiet, looked to the window, where beyond the glass, another day was dying. And in its place, something colder was waiting to rise. The stables behind the Long Lantern Tavern were always colder than the rest of the village. The stone walls sweated at night, and the thatched roof let the wind through like water through a sieve. But to Mara, it was home. Or at least, the place where no one asked too many questions. Her father, Joran, was a quiet man with wide hands and a stiff hip from a fall he never spoke of. He cleaned stalls, mended harnesses, and fed travelers' horses for coin he never spent on himself. When the war ended, he hadn't smiled, just started walking slower. Tonight he was gone, called to help repair the bell housing on the chapel. Mara was alone in the stable with the geldings and the mule with the crooked leg. She should have been asleep. But instead, she sat in the hayloft, knees to her chest, staring through the slats at the courtyard below. She wasn't waiting for anything. She just knew something was coming. The voices came just after moonrise, soft, quick, tense. From her perch, Mara could see only shadows, 2 figures, hoods pulled low, standing near the woodpile behind the tavern. One tall and angular. The other broader, stiff in the shoulders. Their backs were turned, but their words, though hushed, carried. 3 more in Thornaby, said the first voice, sharp, male, unfamiliar. The signs are spreading. They're still watching the roads, answered the second. Council riders came through yesterday. They spoke with the chapel woman. A pause. Then, she's more dangerous than she looks. You want me to remove her? No. Not yet. We're not in the fire. We're still in the smoke. There was a scraping sound, flint striking metal. Mara saw the tip of a match flare orange. One of the men lit a pipe, and for just a moment, his face caught the glow. She had seen him before. He was the quiet one, the man who drank only water. The one with the falcon on his boot. She didn't sleep that night. She waited until the men were gone, crept from the loft, and ran barefoot to the chapel. She didn't knock, only whispered through the shutter slat. Sister Merwin. It's me. Moments later, the door opened. Inside, Merwin and Osric stood around a small table where a single candle burned low. Arlo was asleep by the hearth, cloak pulled over his eyes. Edric sat sharpening a wood chisel, though now he stopped. Mara stood just beyond the threshold, shivering, eyes wide. I heard them, she whispered. 2 men. They know about you. They listened to her story in full. She told them about the meeting behind the tavern, the words she'd heard, the face in the firelight. Her voice was quiet, but not weak. Each sentence made the air tighter. When she finished, silence settled like a blanket soaked in fear. You're sure it was him? Osric asked. The gray cloak? She nodded. He's staying in the small room above the tavern kitchen. I carry water there. He's always listening. He doesn't blink enough. Spoken like someone who's watched closely. Arlo murmured from the fire, now fully awake. Merwin turned to him. What do we do? Arlo stood slowly, rubbing his eyes. We confirm. Then we confront. Osric shook his head. If we confront too soon, we lose the thread. We need to know if he's alone, or part of something larger. Edric leaned back. He mentioned fire and smoke. That sounds like planning, not just symbols. Merwin looked at Mara. You did well. But you're not to speak of this. Not even to your father. Understand? Mara nodded, biting her lip. He'd want to know. But I think he's afraid. The next morning, Edric entered the long lantern under the pretense of measuring the window frame. The tavern keeper, Olwen, knew him well, and didn't question why he lingered longer than needed near the kitchen door. From the shadows, he watched the man in gray. The traveler sat as he always did, drinking only water, jotting something into a small notebook. His eyes scanned the room without moving his head. Calculated. Patient. Dangerous. When Edric turned to leave, the man's gaze met his, just for a second, and smiled. That evening, the council gathered again, now with a new name. Bray Talwick. He had signed the tavern log under it, claiming to be a trader from the northern coast. But there were no trade stamps on his ledger, and the coin he used bore the face of a former prince long presumed dead. He's not hiding well, Arlo said. Because he doesn't need to, Merwin replied. He thinks we're too afraid to act. We're not, Edric said flatly. Osric stepped forward. I'll follow him. He'll lead us to others. We can't cut one head and leave the roots. But what if he senses it? Merwin asked. Then he'll run. Or he'll strike. And you? She asked. Osric's hand fell to the hilt of the knife at his side. I'll be ready. In the quiet hours before dawn, Mara lay awake again in the hayloft. But now, her fear had form. Now, she knew what the shadows held. Below her, the horses shifted uneasily in their stalls. The mule kicked once at nothing. And somewhere in the village, a door creaked open that no one heard. Gravend still slept. But its peace was splintering. And Mara, the stable girl, was now its first watchkeeper. The woods beyond Gravend were still damp from spring rain. Leaves hung heavy on their branches, and moss clung thick to stone and root. The path, though narrow, was one Osric knew well, once used for scouts and couriers during the early years of the war. Now, it served another purpose. He moved silently through the underbrush, boots barely breaking the ground, cloak blending into green and gray. Ahead of him, perhaps 40 paces, Bray Talwick walked with confident ease, unaware he was being followed, or pretending to be unaware. It was hard to tell with men like him. Bray had left the village just before dawn, claiming to check his wagon on the far side of the ridge. But he brought no tools, no rope, no feed. Only his satchel and that little black ledger he never seemed to let go. And now, he was heading into the forest where no cart could go. Osric followed. Back in the village, Merwin sat beside a bucket of fresh linen, wringing water from cloth that no longer carried blood, only dust. The peace had turned her work from life-saving to life-preserving. And still, every day, it felt fragile. Edric entered the chapel quietly, carrying a wooden case. I checked the tavern again, he said, setting it down. And? Merwin asked. The name Bray Talwick exists, but he's not him. The real Bray died 3 winters ago in a raid near Harnley. She turned. You're sure? The registrar in Norwich confirmed it this morning. Joran helped me send the message. Then our guest is using a dead man's name. And he has council coin, Edric added. Old mint. Pre-accord. Not in circulation for nearly 6 years. Merwin's lips tightened. He wants us to notice. He's leaving threads for us to pull. Edric Saturday. Or he's too sure we won't. Meanwhile, Osric crouched behind a low ridge, watching as Bray emerged into a clearing ringed with broken stones and a single, rotted post, what once may have been a marker or a boundary line. Bray knelt, removed the ledger from his satchel, and pulled something from his sleeve, a folded page, pale and stiff. He placed it carefully into the book, then burned it. Osric's breath caught. It wasn't the act that startled him, it was the way Bray watched the flames. Not like someone erasing something, but like someone paying respect. He waited a few minutes more, then turned, and began the walk back toward Gravesend. Osric stayed behind. Once the clearing was silent, he approached the charred spot and sifted through the still warm ashes. He found a half-melted clasp, a page edge, wax residue, pale and unfamiliar. No names, but a single phrase still readable on the scrap. Confirmed sleeper in Grey Hollow. Osric folded the piece carefully and slipped it into his cloak. Then he turned, and froze. A sound behind him. Not a man. A boy. It was Tom Gorse, son of the innkeeper, barely 15, clutching a fishing rod and a line of wet trout. They locked eyes. You didn't see this, Osric said calmly. Tom nodded too quickly. Who else knows you're out here? No one. I come here before breakfast sometimes. Just for fish. Osric stepped closer. You'll tell no one. Not about me. Not about him. Understand? I do, Tom whispered. But what? I've seen that man before. Bray. Not just in the village. Osric narrowed his eyes. Where? Tom glanced to the treeling. A month ago. On the East Road. He was with someone in soldier's mail, but no crest. They passed silver between them. Osric's voice dropped. And you didn't tell anyone? I was scared. I thought maybe he was a crown rider. Osric exhaled. He's not. Tom's gaze flicked to the blackened spot. Is the war coming back? Osric didn't answer. Because he didn't know. When he returned to the village that evening, the sky was turning bronze. At the chapel, Merwin and Edric looked up from the bench where they'd been sorting sealed letters. Well? Merwin asked. Osric tossed the charred scrap on the table. He's not alone. And he's receiving instructions. From who? Edric asked. Osric shook his head. But they're organized. They're embedding. Whoever these people are, they're not looking to start a battle. They're building something slower. Subversion. Merwin murmured. Exactly. Arlo entered a moment later, rubbing his neck. The tavern's quiet tonight. Too quiet. Even Roland's gone home early. That's because something's shifted, Edric said. They can feel it. Osric turned to Merwin. Tomorrow I follow him again. But this time I want backup. Who? She asked. Osric's gaze drifted toward the stables. Mara. She knows the village better than any of us. And they never suspect her. Merwin's brow furrowed. She's a child. She's also brave, Edric said. And already involved. Merwin was silent for a moment, then finally said, If she agrees, I'll allow it. But I won't lose her to this. You won't, Osric promised. But if we don't act now, we may lose everything else. That night, in her corner of the hayloft, Mara looked down at a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a slingshot, a stub of charcoal, and a folded note from Sister Merwin. It read only 4 words. You are not alone. She held it to her chest. Outside, the wind shifted. And deep in the woods, someone else lit a match. At first light, before even the roosters dared to crow, Osric stood waiting near the eastern gate of Gravesend. The mist clung low to the grass like breath that refused to lift. His cloak was pulled tight, his eyes sharper than frost. Beside him stood Mara, hair braided neatly, satchel across her shoulder, cheeks pale but resolute. She wore her brother's old boots, a bit too big, and a green scarf tied twice at the neck. "You sure about this?" Osric asked, voice low. Mara nodded. "I won't get in the way. You already haven't. You got us this far." He handed her a folded piece of cloth. Inside, a simple coin marked with the council seal. "Show this only if you're caught alone. Otherwise, stay near me. And speak little. I'm good at that," she whispered, almost smiling. Together, they set off east, toward Grey Hollow. The path was one few used anymore. It veered off the main trade route and dipped between twin hills dense with rowan and birch. Years ago, Grey Hollow had been a settlement, if one could call 4 houses and a broken mill a settlement. But famine, then fire, then war had emptied it. Now it was just a name on old maps. Osric moved swiftly, eyes scanning everything, the way birds startled, the patterns of recent boot tracks in the mud, the faint smell of old smoke carried by the wind. Mara followed closely, saying nothing, absorbing everything. "What is this place to them?" she finally asked. Osric glanced back. A hiding place. Maybe a meeting point. Maybe a grave. Mara didn't ask more. By midday, the trees opened into a wide bowl of land, and there it was, Grey Hollow. Or what remained. 3 stone chimneys. 2 collapsed walls. A well boarded over. And at the far edge, a structure still standing, an old watch hut with half its roof intact. And movement inside. Osric gestured. "Stay low." They approached quietly, slipping between brush and stone, stopping just short of the structure. Voices. "Not until the next parchment," said one, a woman's voice, clear, clipped. "We're exposed already," said another, male, older. The girl saw him. "The scout may be tracking. The girl is nothing," the woman said sharply. "But the scout, he's harder to erase." Mara's eyes widened. Osric held up a hand. "Wait." Inside the hut, the woman continued. "Orders were clear. We sleep until summoned. The council fails. Then we rise." Osric leaned closer. The dry branch beneath his foot snapped. Silence. Then shouts. Outside. They ran. Osric didn't hesitate. He grabbed Mara's hand and darted west through the ruins, weaving between walls, jumping the old well pit. Behind them, boots crashed through brush. A man shouted, "Get them!" And crossbow bolts hissed past, one striking the dirt inches from Mara's boot. "This way!" Osric called. They plunged down a slope, through thorn and root, until the ground even near a narrow stream. Osric turned, crouched low behind a fallen tree, blade drawn. But no one followed. Just wind. And silence. They waited 5 minutes. Then 10. Only then did Mara speak. "I saw her face," she whispered. "The woman. She was. I think she used to live in Gravend." Osric turned to her. "Who?" Mara's lips trembled. "She brought herbs to the chapel, before peace. Dark hair. Long scar under her chin." Osric's jaw tightened. He knew that face too. They returned under cover of dusk. At the chapel, Merwin and Edric were waiting, Arlo too, pacing near the fire like a restless dog. "What happened?" Edric asked. Osric said only, "We found the sleeper." Mara sat on the floor, pulling off her boots. Her hands trembled, but her voice held steady. "She's from here. Or was. I know it." Merwin leaned in. "Can you describe her?" Mara nodded. "Scar under the chin. Voice like a teacher's. She spoke like she expected to be obeyed." Merwin's face paled. "I know her," she whispered. "That's Lizen Crow." Edric looked up sharply. Lizen died. She was on the red flame transport that burned outside Casterbrook. Or so we were told. Merwin said grimly. Osric dropped the burned scrap from the ledger onto the table. Confirmed sleeper in Grey Hollow. She wasn't sleeping, he said. She was leading. That night, the wind howled harder than usual. Storm clouds thickened on the horizon. In the village, shutters were bolted tight, and dogs whined in the corners of barns. Inside the chapel, four adults sat at the table, with one girl asleep on a bench nearby, her head resting on a folded cloak, hands curled beneath her cheek. She risked everything, Edric said softly. She's braver than most men I've met. Osric replied. We need to warn the steward, Merwin said. This is bigger than a single rebel cell. I'll ride at first light, Arlo offered. But I can't promise they'll act fast. Then we prepare ourselves, Merwin said. Because they will act. Sooner than we think. Osric looked to the window. Lightning flickered in the clouds. They're already moving. In the hut at Grey Hollow, Lizen stood alone. The others were gone. She had burned the parchments, smashed the ink bottles, scattered the coins. But one thing remained, a ring. She slipped it on. The face bore no crest. But inside, engraved in tiny script, were 4 words. When silence ends, rise. She turned toward the darkening woods and smiled. The storm hit just before dawn. It wasn't the loudest the village had seen, nor the wettest. But it came with that still air before the first gust, the kind that makes the hair rise on your arms, that wakes dogs whimpering from sleep. By the time the first drops fell on Graven's chapel roof, Osric was already awake, turning the ring over and over in his hands. It had been found hidden in Bray Talwick's abandoned satchel, slipped between pages of his ledger, the one he left behind after disappearing into the night 2 days earlier. No trace. No tracks. Only this, a plain iron ring, unmarked except for an engraving on the inner band. When silence ends, rise. Symbol? Edric asked that morning, over tea gone cold. More than that, Osric murmured. It's a message. A vow. Merwin took the ring, holding it beneath the lamplight. I've seen something like this, she said quietly. Years ago. Before the siege of Eldwythe. Osric raised an eyebrow. Where? In a field hospital. A man died from an arrow wound, but he clutched a ring like this in his palm. Wouldn't let go, even in his last breath. Who was he? No name. No sigil. But his eyes, they weren't the eyes of a soldier. They were waiting for something. They spread the map across the chapel table, an old vellum sheet marked with rivers, watch points, and shuttered keeps. The engraving, Arlo said, tracing a finger across the river that ran east of Grey Hollow. Could reference this. He pointed. The river silent. Once a border between 2 warring counties, now forgotten. Shallow, slow, and avoided. Edric leaned over the table. There's a bridge here, Silver Cross. Used during the retreat from Drenfield. It's still standing, Merwin said. Barely. I crossed it last summer to fetch herbs from Whitedale. Osric nodded. Then that's our next step. They left at midday. Osric, Edric, and Merwin rode east under low clouds, the river path cloaked in wind and drizzle. Mara stayed behind with Arlo, not by order, but by her own choosing. I'll watch the chapel, she said, hands clasped, jaw firm. And if someone asks why the scout is gone? Arlo asked. She looked him in the eye. I'll lie better than you. The journey to the Silver Cross Bridge took 5 hours. The road curved through hollows of old tree roots and wagon-worn stones. The storm followed at a distance, distant thunder, occasional spits of rain. By late afternoon, the bridge appeared from the mist like a relic from a forgotten world, arched, broken in parts, but still intact enough to walk across. Below it, the river silent moved slowly, black as ink, with weeds like drowned fingers waving just beneath the surface. Edric dismounted first, eyes scanning the tree line. There's been traffic here recently. Osric knelt near the base of the bridge. 2 horses. 1 cart. Steel-rimmed wheels. Merwin moved to the stone pillar where the bridge met the earth, and there, barely visible beneath the moss, she found it. A falcon. scratched into stone. Crude. Recent. They're using this, she whispered. Osric rose. We followed the tracks. They walked another mile along the river until the trail split. One fork led down to the water, where a shallow crossing glistened between rocks. The other veered uphill, toward a small copse of pine. Then they heard it. Voices. Too far to make out the words, but near enough that Edric gestured for silence. Osric moved ahead first, flanking the slope with practiced steps. Merwin and Edric followed slowly behind. At the top of the rise, just beyond a thicket of fern, Osric stopped. Below them was a clearing. 2 men. 1 woman. A cart. And crates stacked, marked, sealed. Arms. Blades. Bows. Arrows. Uniform scraps with no crest. Weapons for a war not yet spoken, Edric muttered. But before Osric could answer, a hand seized his cloak from behind. Going somewhere, friend? Came a voice, oily and smooth. Osric turned. Roland. The blacksmith. Graven's oldest, loudest, bitterest man. And now, traitor. He held a blade in one hand, crooked from years of disuse, but sharp. I should have known, Edric growled. Roland grinned. You should have listened. The war never ended, it just learned how to wait. Behind him, more figures emerged from the trees. 6 in total. All armed. All wearing no colors. Osric didn't hesitate. He threw his elbow back, catching Roland in the ribs, spun, and slammed the hilt of his dagger into the old man's temple. Roland collapsed. Run! Osric barked. They sprinted downslope, into the brush. Arrows hissed past. Someone shouted. Edric ducked beneath a low branch and pulled Merwin behind a fallen tree. We can't outrun them all, she gasped. We don't have to, Osric called, already wading into the shallows of the river. We just have to scatter. Osric! But it was too late. He turned once, shouted. Find Arlo! Get the council! And dove into the black water. He vanished beneath the surface, cloak flaring, then swallowed whole by the current. Merwin's scream was lost to the storm that finally broke overhead. Rain poured like shattered glass. Edric dragged her back up the slope, through the trees, as the rebels circled below. By nightfall, they collapsed behind a stone ridge, soaked and shaking, breath burning in their chests. He's gone, Merwin whispered. Edric didn't answer. But the river said nothing. And Gravend was no longer safe. The storm rolled into Gravend like a warning. Rain hammered the chapel roof in pulses, drumming like distant hoofbeats. Wind howled through the shutters, shaking them on their rusted hinges. Candles flickered against the damp, casting long shadows that danced like uneasy spirits across the stone floor. Mara sat near the fire, her knees tucked to her chest. She hadn't slept. Not since Osric dove into the river and vanished beneath its black coils. Beside her, Arlo stood by the window, peering into the dark beyond the glass. They should have been back by now, she whispered. Arlo said nothing. She turned to look at him. You don't think he's... He didn't meet her eyes. Osric's died before. He just didn't stay dead that time. Mara blinked. What does that mean? It means if anyone could outrun death twice, it'd be him. An hour later, just past the 9th bell, came the knock. Not urgent. Not angry. Just 3 even taps. Arlo stepped back from the window. Stay by the fire, he said, his voice sharp now. Don't speak unless I do. Mara nodded, fingers clutching the wooden talisman Merwin had carved for her months ago. Arlo opened the chapel door halfway. Outside stood a man. Tall. Dry despite the rain. His cloak bore no mud, no wet, no sign of travel. His boots shone. And his smile was polite. Evening, the man said, removing his hood. I apologize for the hour. Arlo didn't move. State your name. The man tilted his head, amused. Names are fragile things these days. But you may call me Vern. I didn't ask for a title. No. Vern said. "But you'll remember it all the same." Behind him, 3 more figures stood, silent still. No insignia. No expressions. Vern's voice remained pleasant. "I'm here to speak with the steward of Gravend." "I believe that's you." Arlo frowned. "The steward does not take audiences after dark." Vern smiled. "Then let us pretend it's morning." Mara could hear every word from where she sat. She shifted closer to the fire, careful not to make a sound. Her gaze drifted to the ledger Merwin had left behind, full of council notes, sealed pages, and a list of names she hadn't dared read. Varen's tone sharpened slightly. "We've received word that one of our own went missing near this village. A man using the name Bray Talik. He left," Arlo said flatly. "Of his own will." "Did he now?" Vern took a step forward. "And before he left, did he happen to mention anything about the Accord?" Arlo's grip on the door tightened. "What is your concern with the Accord?" "Oh, nothing at all," Vern said smoothly. "Except that we intend to rewrite it." He smiled wider now. "Line by line." Behind the chapel, hooves shifted. The other men, soldiers likely, began moving to the sides. Surrounding. Arlo noticed. "Step back," he said. "This is still royal ground." Vern nodded slowly. "Indeed it is. For now." Then, softly, "I suggest you burn any letters you've been saving. The ones meant for lords who no longer command armies." Arlo's jaw flexed. "And if I don't?" Varen's voice was kind. "Then Gravend will be the first example." He turned casually and walked back into the rain. The others followed. Their cloaks didn't rustle. Their steps didn't echo. When the door shut, Mara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Arlo bolted it twice. Then turned to her. "Go wake the blacksmith's wife. Quietly. Tell her to send word to Merwin if she's still alive." Mara nodded. "And Mara." She paused in the doorway. "If I fall before they return, don't run. Don't fight." "Then what?" "Disappear." She slipped out the side door into rain and night. Wind tore at her scarf, and mud soaked her boots before the second step, but she didn't care. She darted through the alley behind the bakery, past the old well, and toward the smith's cottage, the one lit only by a single low lantern in the window. But when she reached the door, it was already ajar. Inside, the hearth was cold. The room was quiet. And on the table, a ring. Black iron. Engraved. Back in the chapel, Arlo sat at the edge of the pew, one hand on his dagger, the other on the parchment he'd written earlier that night. It bore 6 words. "The fire is lit beneath us." He folded it twice, sealed it, and waited for dawn. Far from the village, deep in the woods, a figure dragged himself onto the riverbank. Wet. Bruised. Alive. Osric Hale lay gasping in the mud, staring up at the trees as thunder cracked above. He smiled through the blood on his lips. Then whispered, "Your turn now." Dawn came red. Not the soft pink of spring or the cool silver of morning fog. This was the red of rusted steel and dried blood, a sun that rose like it regretted shining. In Gravend, shutters opened slowly. Eyes blinked into gray light, searching for smoke, for bodies, for anything to prove the fears of the night. But the village stood still. For now. At the chapel, Arlo sat hunched over the altar table, eyes rimmed red with no sleep. The sealed message he'd written lay on the bench beside him, along with his dagger and the council token, small comforts in the shadow of the night's visitor. Mara returned just before sunrise, soaked to the bone, her braid undone, eyes wide with silence. "You were gone too long," Arlo said. "There's no one at the smith's," she whispered. "No wife. No dog. Just a ring. The same kind." He stood slowly. "They've already started." In the woods, Osric staggered through bramble and thorn, bleeding from the shoulder where a rock had opened his skin. The river had spit him out 2 miles south of the bridge. He had slept in a hollow tree for 2 hours before the pain woke him again. Now he walked, not toward safety but toward truth. His boots squelched with water, and each step was a reminder. He was alive. He was late. But he wasn't done. And someone had to know. By mid-morning, Merwin and Edric reached the edge of the village, soaked and cold, with mud up to their knees. They found Arlo first. He didn't speak. Just handed Merwin the message and pointed to the bolted door. They came, he said. And they smiled. She read the note. The fire is lit beneath us. Her hand shook. Then she asked, Where's Mara? In the kitchen. Won't speak. Merwin walked quickly to her, knelt, took both her hands. What happened, little one? Mara's voice was faint. They were already gone. She didn't scream. She just left. Like someone called her. Who? I don't know. But the answer would come sooner than any of them expected. At midday, the tavern bell rang. A sound not heard in months. The tavern keeper's summons, 3 long notes. It had once meant celebration. Now it sounded more like an alarm. Villagers gathered, hesitant, along the square. Rain still misted the ground, and smoke from distant hearths coiled like watchful snakes. Vern stood beneath the tavern's front awning, calm and dry as ever. This time, he wore no hood. His hair was neat. His boots polished. Behind him, the tavern keeper, Olwen, stood pale, her arms at her sides, eyes unfocused. She's one of them. Arlo muttered. Merwin didn't answer. She was too busy watching the others in the crowd. Too many looked tired. Too many looked silent. Vern raised a hand. My friends, he called gently. You have heard rumors. You've seen strangers. And now you begin to wonder, who leads? Who protects? He smiled. And I bring you only truth. Behind him, Olwen opened a leather satchel. She drew out 6 rings. All black iron. Engraved. 1 by 1. Vern said. We return what was taken. Voice. Power. Pride. This village will not be left behind in the new dawn. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some, like old Roland, now healed and standing tall again, nodded. Others stepped back. Vern turned his gaze toward the chapel. Those who still serve the broken crown, he said louder now, will tell you this is treason. But I tell you, this is reckoning. And then came the sound no one expected. A whistle. 3 short bursts, bird-like. Scout's signal. Osric. He stepped from the tree-lean, mud-crusted and pale, blood seeping from beneath his collar. One arm held close to his side. But his eyes burned. Gasps rose. Thought he was dead, someone whispered. Looks like the river refused him. Another murmured. Osric limped forward. Merwin ran to him first, placing a steadying hand on his arm. He didn't stop. He walked straight into the square. Straight to Vern. You talk too much, he rasped. Vern tilted his head. And yet you still listen. I swam through black water for a mile, Osric said. Chased by your men. Watched 2 villages burn in your name. And you think you'll stand here in open daylight and win hearts? Vern smiled. Not hearts. He snapped his fingers. Roland stepped forward. And from the crowd, so did Tobin, the young farmer. And behind him, the baker's apprentice, the shepherd, even the candlemaker's eldest son. 6 in total. All wearing black iron rings. Silence fell like a dropped knife. You thought this was a shadow, Vern said, voice soft again. But it is a structure. And it has already taken root. Osric looked at the crowd. Then at Edric, who now held his hammer like a blade. Then at Merwin, whose eyes glistened, not with fear, but with fury. And finally at Mara, peering from the chapel door, clutching the talisman in both hands. He drew a long breath. This village has survived plague, famine, and war, he said. It has buried kings and crowned cowards. But it will not kneel to you. Vern gave a single nod. Then let the fire speak for itself. He turned and walked into the tavern. The others followed. And as the door closed behind them, smoke began to pour from the roof. Not fire from kitchen flame, but from oil. From intention. The fire had begun. Not with blades, but with silence spoken aloud. The flames rose fast. The tavern's thatched roof caught first, dry from wind and dust, and within moments, the long lantern blazed like a pyre lit for a forgotten king. Orange light spilled onto the square, illuminating stunned faces and trembling hands. The people of Gravend didn't scream. They stood. Still. Watching. Some in awe. Others in horror. And above them all, smoke coiled into the morning sky like a question left unanswered. Merwin moved first. She grabbed the nearest pail from beside the well and shouted, "Buckets! Ropes! Anyone with hands, help!" A few villagers hesitated. Then one, the baker's daughter, broke from the crowd and ran to her. Then another. And another. By the time Edric reached the fire, 10 villagers were hauling water. 20 more formed the line. But the tavern was already lost. They could only keep the flames from spreading. From devouring the homes beside it. From leaping to the chapel. Vern was gone. He and his black-ringed followers had slipped out the tavern's back entrance moments before the fire rose. Osric saw it in the ashes, clean, practiced escape. A decoy. Not destruction, but demonstration. He watched the flames with clenched fists, blood still drying on his shoulder. "They want to see who stands and who kneels," he murmured. Arlo, who had just returned with villagers from the far fields, nodded grimly. "It's working. Half the village won't even meet my eyes." "They're choosing," Merwin said, joining them. "One side or the other. There is no more middle." Osric looked at her. "Then we give them something to choose for." By late afternoon, the tavern was a smoking skeleton. The fire hadn't reached the chapel or the granary, thanks to the bucket line, the soaked linens, and Edric's furious hammering to break the fire wall between roofs. The square was quiet again, but the stillness now pulsed with tension. That was when Liz and Crow returned. She walked openly through the southern gate, cloaked in gray, hair pinned in a soldier's braid, a sword at her hip. Her chin bore the same old scar. And beside her walked a boy with sharp gray eyes. Tom Gorse. The innkeeper's son. He held a torch in one hand. But it wasn't lit. The village watched them. No one spoke. Lizanne stopped in front of the chapel steps. Her voice rang clear. "You've seen the fire. You've seen what silence has protected. Now I offer truth." Osric stepped forward. "You offer chains. I offer a future," she snapped. "One not written by kings with soft hands and broken promises. We've bled for this land. And now we'll own it." She turned, sweeping her eyes across the crowd. "Anyone who joins us will be protected. Federal armed. We march in 3 days." "And those who don't?" Edric asked. Lizanne smiled. "They'll be remembered kindly." Silence. Then, Tom stepped forward. He looked at Osric. Then at Merwin. Then at the torch in his hand. And dropped it. "No," he said, voice shaking. "I won't burn what raised me." Lizanne's expression flickered. Then turned cold. She grabbed the boy by the arm, hard, but before she could speak, a hammer slammed the ground beside her boot. "Edric. Let him go." She did. Not because of the hammer, but because of what she saw in Edric's eyes. Conviction. And rage. Lizanne turned without a word and walked away, cloak trailing in the ash. Tom stood in the square, shaking. Merwin crossed to him, wrapping a shawl around his shoulders. "You chose well," she said softly. "I almost didn't," he whispered. "But you did," she said. "That's what matters." That night the chapel was full. Not with prayer, but with people. Some frightened. Some furious. All uncertain. Osric stood near the altar, arm bandaged, eyes tired. "You know now what we face," he said. "Not soldiers. But a movement. Built slow. Built quiet. and now bold enough to burn us in daylight. He looked at each face. You don't have to fight. But if you stay silent, you help them. Edric stepped up beside him. I can build barriers, block roads, strengthen doors. But only if I know they're worth protecting. Mara, standing near the fire, raised her voice. I know this place. Every tunnel. Every hollow. Every hiding place. I'll help. Merwin placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we begin tonight. At the rear of the chapel, Arlo opened a dusty chest and drew out a long-wrapped bundle. Inside, an old war banner. Worn. Torn. But not forgotten. The sigil, a golden tree on a green field. The standard of Glenwood, once flown during the last true defense of the borderlands. Osric unfolded it slowly, and raised it above the chapel hearth. No one cheered, but every head turned, and something deep beneath the skin of the village shifted. The fire had taken the tavern, but not the village, and not the will to stand. It began before dawn. A hush settled over Gravend, not of fear this time, but of preparation. Doors creaked open. Lanterns were lit behind curtained windows. Boots were laced tighter. Tools were sharpened not for craft, but for defense. Osric stood beneath the chapel's rebuilt awning, cloak pinned tight with the sigil of the golden tree. His wounds had scabbed, but his eyes were sharper than ever. Beside him, Merwin braided Mara's hair with steady hands. Why the braid? The girl asked softly. It's how my mother prepared me for storms, Merwin said. It keeps the wild out of your eyes. By mid-morning, Liz and Crow returned. She rode now, armored, flanked by 5 men and 1 woman. All carried crossbows. All bore the black iron ring on their hands. She halted at the village square. This is your last invitation, she said, voice flat. Lay down your council oaths. Join us, and live beyond the fall. Osric stepped forward alone. No, he said. Then louder. We will not kneel to a fire pretending to be a flag. She narrowed her eyes. Then you'll burn with the rest. She raised her hand, a signal. But the first arrow did not fly from her ranks. It came from behind the chapel, and struck the ground at her horse's feet. Edric stepped into view next, hammer slung across his back, bow in hand. You said 3 days? He called. Today is only the 2nd. Lizen laughed once. You kept count? He smiled. I build walls. Counting is part of it. Then from the bakery, 2 more villagers emerged. Then from the smith's alley. Then from the well. Then from rooftops. 23 in total. No armor. Few weapons. But all of them wearing green cloth, torn sashes, apron cords, old ribbons, each piece a quiet oath. Lizanne's riders hesitated. She did not. Fire it is, she snapped. But no one moved. Because the people of Gravend had not come to fight. They had come to refuse. The rebellion's riders were trained to expect battle, not stillness. And in that stillness something faltered. Osric stepped forward again. He unpinned the banner from his shoulder and held it high. The accord was broken, he said. Not by kings. Not by rebels. But by silence. He turned slowly, speaking to the village, not to Lizanne. Today, we write it again. Not on parchment. But in place. In names. In who we protect, and who we stand beside. He lowered the banner and drove the pole into the earth. Behind him, Merwin placed her hand on it. Then Edric. Then Arlo. Then Mara. And slowly, others followed. Lizanne stared at them. Not at their hands, but at their lack of fear. She drew her blade. Osric didn't flinch. You'll die for a village? She asked. No, he said. I'll live for it. She raised her sword. And then, Tobin stepped forward. Unarmed. From the crowd. Don't, he said. You trained me once, remember? You taught me to hold a blade. But you also said strength is knowing when not to lift it. Lizanne's hand shook. You're a boy. I'm a villager, he said. And so are they. The sword dropped. Not to the ground, but to her side. She turned her horse without a word. The others followed. No retreat was called. No orders barked. They simply left. For hours after, the village said little. No one rang the bell. No one sang. But by sunset, the chapel was full again. This time for truth. They burned the remaining rebel rings in a clay bowl behind the altar. Mara held the flame. And Osric, beside her, finally let himself sit down. You've earned a rest, Merwin said. He smiled wearily. Just don't ask me to pray. Too late, she said. You already did. Edric returned to his workshop, and in the days to come, rebuilt the tavern, not as it was, but as a gathering hall. A place for meetings, not ale. For messages, not mugs. The village named it the Accord House. Inside, over the hearth, hung two things. The golden banner of Glenwood, and the charred edge of a rebel ring, cracked clean down the middle. Peace returned. But this time, it was not carried by kings. It was held, day by day, in the callous hands of a village that